Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to introduce to the show journalist John Walters. He is the force behind the Vermont Political Observer. And I really want to thank him today because we're recording Thursday, the 12th. And because I had another writing deadline, I was planning on running a rebroadcast this week. And then the news about Governor Scott vetoing H.91 hit my feed, and I went, well, there goes that plan. Have to have a conversation about this somehow. So thank you, John, for jumping in between multiple appointments and tomorrow's journalism conference at UVM to have a conversation about H.91.
And whatever else comes up in the next hour.
As you and I are wont to do. I want to hear your thoughts in a moment, but just in case listeners haven't been up on H.91, it's a bill to replace the hotel motel program and to help rehouse many of Vermont's homeless community members. And in very broad strokes, what it would have done was do away with that program and hand, I would say, a number of tasks over to Vermont's 5 community action organizations. And to me, and Emily Kornheiser was on the show a couple weeks ago and gave more details if you want to look up that episode. But to me, it really felt like a true overhaul of how we've been addressing a number of our emergency housing needs, but also some of our long-term needs. Does that sound fair to you, John, as a broad overview?
Yeah, add a little more background. This voucher program has been going on for several years. It costs a lot of money. It's not ideal. Nobody really likes it. It's just better than nothing is pretty much the best thing you can say for it. And Governor Scott in particular has been complaining about the program and the cost of it for years. He has never proposed a replacement program, which is what his administration should have done long ago. This year, the legislature finally got tired of waiting and went ahead and created its own replacement program for the voucher system, and that is embodied in House Bill 91. And this was kind of above and beyond what the legislature should be called upon to do. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to create a program from scratch. The administration has tons more resources than the legislature does. I'm frankly pretty amazed that the legislature was able to pull this off. And that's one reason why it's a shame that the governor has seen fit to veto the bill.
Yeah. I want to remind listeners in the show notes, I'll link to the governor's veto letter where he walks the legislature through why he is vetoing this bill. And one thing he keeps calling the hotel motel program, he keeps calling it the pandemic era program. And I just want to remind folks that this program existed before the pandemic. It had some different guardrails around it. But it did exist before the pandemic. During the pandemic, it was expanded so more people could take advantage of it. And then after the pandemic, what's that?
Because there were more homeless people.
Right. And with Vermont's rising housing costs and our lack of inventory, homelessness has been increasing across the state. And so I'm not sure calling it the pandemic era program is really as accurate as one could be. It has been around a lot longer than just the pandemic.
Yes.
And yes, people have not liked it for even before the pandemic.
Yep. And yeah, it's a Band-Aid. And the problem is we have failed to either address the lack of shelter or lack of resources for homeless people or uh, the housing crisis,
Mhm.
which has gotten worse and worse. And it's bad in all sectors. You know, we don't have enough housing for rich people, but the burden is especially crushing on the poor and the working poor. One of the things I wrote in my post about this veto is that there are a lot of people, homeless people, unsheltered people in Vermont who actually have jobs,
Sometimes more than one.
sometimes more than one, or they have one full-time job and they have jobs that don't pay enough to, underwrite the the very high cost of housing in Vermont and the lack of supply.
Mhm.
We've had people move to Vermont, like in the medical field. We've had nurses move to Vermont. Hospitals have set them up in rental uh, apartments temporarily so that they could start work. And they wind up like doing several months to a year, and they just can't find housing, and they move away again. They're lucky enough to have a job in a decent paying field, but a lot of, again, back to the point, there are a lot of homeless people and unsheltered people who work, who
Mhm.
work as much as they can and work hard. They're just not paid enough to, underwrite the cost of a place to live.
Yes, and just to kind of expand on what you said, John, I was speaking with um, a housing trust person for another article I'm working on, Michael Monte, up in Chittenden County, and he pointed out that yes, there are a number of employers who know their employees are living in their cars,
Yep.
um, and the market is tight, wages are tight. You know, we know this across the board. But the other thing Michael said that I thought was interesting was he reminded me that we have, especially in Chittenden County at least, we have added more housing units to the rental market. Um, but one, the cost of building housing has gone up so much that those rental units are being priced at a higher rent than units that are on the market currently. For example, a current, what he called an old apartment, meaning, been around for a few years, might be 1,600 a month, but a new build apartment might be around 2,100 a month just because of the cost of development and everything. And so again, you get someone who you're in a tight market with wages being what they are, even if you find a new build,
Yeah.
it may still be out of your price range.
Yep. Um, so the governor, vetoed this bill, which would have solved the problem that he claims he wants to solve, but hasn't produced a solution of his own. During the session, while the legislature was hammering out this plan, um, his administration was pretty much nowhere to be found.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't coming to the table and saying, okay, here's what we would like to see in a new program, here's what we're willing to accept. On May 17th, uh, which in any other year would be either just before adjournment or past adjournment, Human Services Secretary Jenny Samuelson sent a memo to the legislature basically outlining all of her complaints and problems with H91.
Mm-hmm.
That's way too late to have any impact. You can't just tear up the bill and rewrite it at that point. It's going to either go through the legislature and go to the governor, or it's going to die.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was not a serious attempt at negotiation.
No.
And, at the time, the media was generally saying, well, it's unclear whether Phil Scott will sign the housing bill or not, the voucher bill or not. I thought that the Samuelson memo was a great big, red flag warning siren, DEFCON 1, that the governor was going to veto it. And
Mm-hmm.
so here we are.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to um, dictate intent to the governor because I don't know what's going through his head. But I think you and I definitely have expressed our frustration on this show before with these the veto feels like a last minute measure to just be like to kind of push legislations back up against the wall. He there's so many other ways that he could have made his concerns known. That memo you mentioned could have come out in November saying these are the things that we would veto if they were in a bill. I mean, there were so many other ways to go about this, and that a last minute veto after months of work by the legislature, it keeps feeling like, to me on the outside looking in, it feels like this is the governor is saying this is what I want, and I'll just keep shoving things into a corner last minute until I get what I want.
Yeah,
That's what it
or not.
feels like to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is I every time he vetoes more bills, I check. The Vermont State Archives maintains
Mhm.
a web page with all of the gubernatorial veto messages that have ever been given.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun. Some of the early vetoes are a little weird. Howard Dean once vetoed a bill to legalize sparklers because he was worried about kids like losing fingers and that sort of thing. But anyway,
Okay.
um, Howard Dean, until Phil Scott came along, was the by far the record holder for the most gubernatorial vetoes. He vetoed 21 bills in 11 plus years as governor.
Yeah.
Phil Scott has vetoed, this is his 56th by my count. So he has more than doubled Howard Dean's total in less time. And he is on track to triple probably by the end of his current term next year. And who knows how long this will keep going on, but it's dysfunctional. It's
Yeah.
fundamentally dysfunctional. And you might say, well, he's had to deal with the Democratic legislature, which is true.
Mhm.
But Jim Douglas had to deal with the Democratic legislature for most of his time as governor. And he, I mean, he was known in legislative circles for uh, constantly being involved in the legislative process and bargaining and negotiating and giving input. And he didn't always get what he wanted, but he was involved in the process in a way that, again, legislative leaders I have heard over and over again absolutely bemoaning the lack of input from Governor Phil Scott, because they say, quite often some of these vetoes are deeply principled vetoes,
Mhm.
but some of them are over relatively minor issues that could have been easily ironed out with probably a phone call,
Mhm.
if not a face-to-face meeting. And he's governing in a completely different way than any other governor has governed before in terms of his relationship with the legislature. And it's not productive. We keep, the legislature passed a few bills when it had a supermajority that pushed the ball forward on a number of issues that we're facing. But otherwise, this sort of like perpetual standoff and perpetual rejection of the legislature's work is no way to get things done.
Mhm. Right. It creates a very high stakes environment, and it, like you said, it is inefficient. As you were talking about Douglas, I was sort of casting back my memory, trying to think about the big controversies and everything like that during his tenure. And there were some, but nothing like this. It's gotten to the point near the end of the session where I sit there and I don't ask, I wonder what bills Scott's going to pass. I sit there and say, how many is he going to veto?
Yep.
Which, yeah, to your point, for someone who has constantly said we need to save money and we need to not put such a burden on the taxpayers, this approach doesn't seem to support um, efficiency and saving money and saving time and coming up with policy that could do the same.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of crises and issue situations that have gotten worse during Phil Scott's time as governor.
Hmm.
You can, from housing to public education to, economic development in general, where we have done okay, but not great. Our demographic challenges have really not been addressed at all. He tinkers around the edges with things like, incentives for workers to move here and stuff like that. But um, there has been a lack of big actions when, Phil Scott has a huge amount of political capital at his disposal, and he could easily come out with, some pretty wide-ranging dramatic reforms. He did so on education this year, but he has rarely, if ever, done that before, and he still hasn't done that on a whole wide range of issues that have just kind of just kept getting a little worse all the time. And I have been saying this for a couple of years now. Whoever the next governor is going to have a big mess to clean up.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Which
and
is a sad thing to say.
yeah, and with what's going on in Washington and what's likely to keep going on in Washington, the next governor is going to have no money to play with at all. So it's going to take some real work, and it's the kind of work that Phil Scott doesn't seem inclined to put in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know this is going to sound naive of me, but I often feel disappointed with the standoffs between the administration and the legislature because I actually look at it as an opportunity that we have a strong Democratic presence in the legislature and a governor that is a Republican, or even if it was vice versa, just to me, it's an opportunity to have more voices, more beliefs, more thoughts at the table. But people have to come to the table for that type of political diversity to be effective.
Yeah, and that is precisely who we thought Phil Scott was.
Mm,
First elected him, he was
yeah.
moderate Republican, a nice guy, able to get along with everybody, and seemingly wanted to govern from the center,
Mm-hmm.
govern on behalf of all Vermonters. His veto record alone would suggest that he is a very different governor than the one we thought we were electing and the one he promised he would be. Uh,
I think you pointed out in your recent post on House 91 that he had come in and said we need to take care of the most vulnerable. We need to change our demographics, and there was one other point he keeps hammering that is slipping my brain at the moment. Um, and in your post, you pointed out that many of his vetoes do not support those three
yeah,
goals.
and particularly in this case, vetoing the voucher replacement bill
Mm-hmm.
was and complaining about the cost of the program and wanting to cut the cost at a time when our housing crisis just keeps getting worse and worse, and people that can't afford apartments. And 7 Days published an article this week about how probably hundreds to 1,000 or more Vermont households that are currently getting Section 8 vouchers from the federal government are going to lose them this year.
Mm-hmm.
Our homelessness crisis is about to get worse.
Yeah.
Um, and yet we're stuck with an expensive, inefficient voucher system that often puts people in substandard housing, doesn't address their long-term needs or give them a pathway out of their situation. And again, the governor complains about that, but he doesn't do anything to solve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to me because when I think about our emergency and long-term housing systems for folks who are dealing with either housing insecurity or are living um, without housing, it's like our whole system over time has gotten backed up. So at one point, the shelter system was supposed to support people for like 3 to 6 months until they got into permanent housing, but we didn't have enough affordable permanent housing. So now people are living in the shelter for years, which then backs up to the next phase. And then when you get to the emergency hotel program, which it was supposed to be like cold weather, get people out of the elements,
Yep.
let them stay, a few nights until it, whatever, they get another bed or the weather changes. And now people are living with these vouchers for months or a year at a time because the whole system just keeps backing up.
Even nice motels are not meant to be long-term residences.
No.
Uh, they're just not built for that, and especially like the budget motels that are the heart and soul of the voucher program.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So, what do you think, or what are you seeing on the radar right now as the next steps?
well, we're going to limp through another year where there's not enough funding and there's not enough supply in the voucher program. People are going to be cut off. They're going to be unsheltered. It's probably going to be worse because of the Section 8 cuts. Um, and Phil Scott is going to go on complaining about a program that he hasn't lifted a damn finger to replace or change. It's pretty bleak,
Mm-hmm.
and it's bleak enough for those of us who want our government to work well.
Yeah.
Uh, it's a lot bleaker for people who are teetering on the edge of not having a roof over their heads and having no certainty. That's one of the problems with the voucher program as it is being managed by the Scott administration is that there is no certainty or consistency to it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the administration has been taken to court and lost over the lack of notice it gives to people that their eligibility is ending. Um, they every time there's sort of a budget negotiation, they play brinksmanship with the voucher program, and that means we run right up to critical deadlines with no certainty about what's going to happen next week or next month, which is no way to give people a solid foundation for progressing in their own lives, which is what the vast majority of people in this program want to do.
Mm-hmm.
They want to have dignity. They want to be able to work. They want to have a roof over their heads, provide for their children. Um, they're not, in his veto message, the governor sort of made a thinly veiled reference to the old Republican shibboleth about the unworthy poor. Um, you know, um, One of the things he called upon for a replacement to the voucher program is requirements to engage in work and training,
Yes.
which makes it sound like these are a bunch of lazy people who are lying on their beds and eating snack food, when in fact the vast majority of them, as I said, want to work or are already working. They just can't make enough money um, to put a roof over their heads. So,
Mm-hmm.
for him to say that, it's not quite, the Washington, D.C. conservative going on TV and complaining about all the kids playing video games in the young people playing video games in their parents' basements and, sponging off of Medicaid. There probably are a few people like that, but the vast majority of Medicaid recipients are not that.
Mm-hmm.
Vast majority of motel voucher clients are not that either. You meet these people, you talk to them, you hear some of them have testified before the legislature. They are clearly people who have had, problems and issues and setbacks, but they are also people with dignity who can speak fluently about their situations. I have said that we should be involving these people in the design of human services programs because they know what it's like to navigate the system and get these benefits or be denied these benefits when they should get them. But that's I'm getting off track here. That's an issue for another day. I just whenever somebody like Phil Scott you know, gripes about essentially gripes about the unworthy poor, I just get angry.
Mm-hmm.
Republicans have been doing this for literally decades, and it's never true. But it's the only way they can defend inhumane cuts.
Yes, to say that the folks aren't worthy. Before we hear from some underwriters, John, it it's unclear to me if the legislature will have the votes to override the veto for House 91. Thoughts?
I would be virtually certain that they won't. They
Okay.
wouldn't. I don't think they'll even try.
Hmm.
We're already in mid-June, and they only have a couple of weeks left to even try to override vetoes. I don't get the sense that the Democratic leadership is even going to try on any of these because they would have to keep their own caucuses together solid, and they would have to attract Republican votes. You know, in the Senate, the Democrats and progressives have a combined 17 votes. They would need 20 to override a veto.
Hmm.
And that means convincing three Republican senators to cross the aisle, support a Democratic bill, and go against the express wishes of their governor. And I don't see that happening much, if at all. Um, Legislative leadership usually doesn't even try for overrides until or unless they are really certain or extremely confident about succeeding.
Hmm.
Uh, so I'd be surprised if there were any attempts to override vetoes this year.
Interesting. And again, I go to my naive
And
place
they still
of
have this
what?
education reform, and they still have this education reform thing hanging over their heads. If they're going to get anything done between now and the end of the month, the end of the session year, it's going to be that. Uh,
Mhm.
it's probably not going to be anything else.
Yeah. Well, again, I go to my naive place of saying, well, the governor and legislative leadership didn't elect you guys, your community did. And what does your community need? And if this H91 is what your community needs, then it doesn't really matter
Yep.
to me what everyone else says. But like I said, that's my naive place. So we're going to hear from some underwriters, folks. So stay tuned. You're listening to the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW LP Brattleboro. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I'm Olga Peters, the host and producer of this show, and I'm speaking with journalist John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. Um, Thank you, BCTV, for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with media centers around the state. And John, do you happen to remember what we need to remind listeners of?
I am not as good at it as Emily Kornheiser got to be, but the views expressed in during the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guest, respectively, and do not reflect the views of any media organization that carries or broadcasts or promotes the content herein.
Very well done. Why, thank you. And as if you're just joining us, I also want to thank John again because, like I said, we're recording this on Thursday the 12th. Because of a writing deadline, I was just going to rebroadcast a show this week. And then, as we spoke about H91 in the first half, I guess we needed to get some venting out of our system. So thank you, John, for literally from like 10 minutes after I sent the text, jumping on this show. So the other thing that's big bill that's hanging out there is the education reform bill. And it's been going through the committee of conference with the Senate and the House, trying to reconcile all the different nuances that have come up around this bill since the beginning of the session. There is a penciled in day on June 16th where they're supposed to come back and kind of vote on this bill and clean up any last minute work. But from what I've seen, John, it doesn't look like things are going as well as we had hoped with some of these negotiations. And or am I missing something?
No, and it would be
Damn.
difficult enough if you had the Democratic legislature and the Republican governor needing to find common ground. what we seem to have here is a situation where the House and Senate are divided along different lines,
Yeah.
but are as badly divided as they are with the governor.
Hmm.
It's a weird and bad situation to be in. You know, the way this is supposed to work when you have two legislative chambers that are controlled by the same party is that they more or less agree on policy and they kind of form a common ground and they work, negotiate with the governor. Where this is all going, I have no idea. And I have written about the Senate's weirdness around education policy. um, they, you know, they put together, the Senate leadership put together a Senate Education Committee, knowing that this was going to be a crucial bill, a crucial year for education issues, with three Democrats and three Republicans on it.
Hmm.
The idea, according to the Senate leadership, was that they would produce bipartisan legislation, which sounds nice. But the other thing is that the chair of the committee is a freshman senator, Seth Bongartz from Bennington County, who served for 19 years on the governing board of Burr and Burton Academy, which is one of the independent schools that collects a lot of, public school tuition to educate students who would otherwise be in public schools. So he isn't exactly a friend of the public school system. That was a weird move. And then when the Senate, when the Senate and House each named three members to this committee of conference, the Senate chose Bongartz, the chair, um, Senator Ann Cummings, who's chair of Senate Finance, which is appropriate because we're talking about a lot of financial issues here,
Hmm.
and Republican Minority Leader Scott Beck,
Mm.
who teaches at St. Johnsbury Academy, one of the other big independent schools.
Yeah.
So the Senate Conference Committee has a majority that are deeply tied to independent schools and not particularly tied to public schools.
Hmm.
And, the Senate conferees, like at the last minute, came up with a brand new bill that was very different from the bills that either the House or Senate had passed. And the House members of the conference committee basically threw up their hands and walked away. And since then, they have been trying, largely behind closed doors, to hammer out their differences. And the time is running out. We have no idea how much progress they've made. There was a fascinating piece done by Vermont Public on June 6th, where their two reporters, Pete Hirschfeld and Lola Dufour, had a conversation about the House Senate divisions. They had, gotten hold of some of the back channel communications between the Senate and the House, and it did not sound at all like they were getting any closer to common ground. They were having all sorts of process arguments. They weren't even arguing over policy. They were arguing over stuff like when they would meet. It's presumably they will manage to find common ground somehow, and maybe they've made progress in the last few days, but it sure didn't sound like it, earlier this week as we are speaking.
Hmm.
Uh, and if you're interested, if you are a liberal or a fan of public schools or a Democratic voter, it is not a great situation for Democratic policy to have the House and Senate in a standoff.
Mm.
What they should be doing is presenting a common face against what the governor wants to do. So
Hmm.
it's a really weird and unpredictable situation. Everybody feels compelled to pass some kind of a bill this year. Um, I think, given the badness of the situation and the fact that any legislation they pass is going to be hastily put together and will be, ripe for unintended consequences. The bills that have been advanced so far, the ideas that have been advanced so far, the bills that the House and Senate have passed, they know have some flaws in them. That would force like pretty significant tax increases in a number of poorer communities.
Hmm.
And the worst thing you can do when you're trying to overhaul a system that it is as big and complicated and important as our K through 12 public education, this is the kind of thing that shouldn't be rushed. And
Hmm.
that seems like what our political leaders are bent on doing, is rushing through something. And it's probably something that they will have to fix next year.
I know. Yeah. Right.
In
Yeah.
fact, we have heard of situations where people have voted in favor of bills that they didn't like just to keep the process moving forward,
Hmm.
which I guess makes some sense in terms of the legislative process, but it certainly seems, it doesn't seem like the best way to do things.
Yeah. Yeah. Going into this process, one of my concerns was, and it's been a concern around how we do education in Vermont in general. We often feel, or it seems like we have these two ideals sort of pulling at each other. And one is the ideal of equitable access to education, and the other is keeping property taxes low. And they just going into this process both seemed like they were pulling at each other even more than they usually do. I will say I was a little heartened, at least as far as the House bill goes, talking last week with Laura Sibilia, one of the independent reps down here in Windham County. She had some very positive things to say about the House bill. And for someone who has been on the school board and has gone through funding and has taken issue with Act 60 and other things like that, I found that really heartening, which in a way makes the clash between the Senate and the House even more disheartening for me.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things I'm sure that Representative Sibilia, she represents a rural area of Vermont.
Hmm.
Uh, you
With
know,
school choice.
rural areas are going to be hit the hardest by whatever comes out of this.
Yeah.
If the ultimate package is oriented toward cutting cost and saving, and at least holding taxes steady, if not reducing them, then it's going to result in a wave of consolidations and school closures, and they're not going to happen in Burlington. They're going to happen in small communities around the state.
Hmm.
In fact, I have written before that if I was a Republican, I would feel very conflicted at best about supporting the governor's proposal, which would have imposed class size among many other things, would have imposed class size minimums that would have immediately required a lot of school closures
Yeah.
in Republican areas.
Hmm.
Now, this is the thing where the Republican policy solution is going to hurt Republican areas more than it's going to hurt anybody else.
It's a good point.
So, if I was a Republican, I'd be hoping that the House version wins out over the Senate version or the governor's version, but that's not how politics works.
Hmm.
Uh, so, we don't know. Hopefully we will find out something by next Tuesday, the 16th. But it's hard to see. Well, things tend to come together quickly at the end of sessions when there's a deadline and everybody wants to get something done. And the governor has threatened to keep calling the legislature back into session until they pass some kind of school reform bill that he is willing to sign. So
Those are two big conditions.
that's, and they've already been in session for longer than almost any other year. Well, they've been all but adjourned for the last 10 days or so, but or to 2 weeks, but they're still technically in session. They still have to be able to get to Montpelier on a moment's notice
Yeah.
to advance something. um, and these are people who have lives and they have jobs or they have family obligations, asking them to be in Montpelier for 5 months of the year is quite a stretch. And now you know, you know, they're into serious overtime. And if leadership can't come together on an education reform bill, there's no telling how long this might go on.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. One of my just big picture concerns with the how this bill has been coming together, it's not with the bill itself. My bigger concern is if we pass something that really doesn't work. There are so many people who are frustrated with the education system in general, whether it's the funding size or the administration side or the classroom, whatever it is, they're frustrated. Um, and when government passes things that don't work or are inefficient or are done in an inefficient way or in a way that people can't understand, it lowers their trust in general for government. And I think right now, given the proposals that are being made around how we could potentially change education, as much community support as possible is going to be needed. And so every opinions will vary. Not everyone would agree with the bill, but people need to be able to get behind it at the community level. And so that's like a big picture kind of
yep.
worry of mine.
Well, as a reminder, you go back to last year, the legislature passed a school reform bill that created a commission on the future of public education.
Which I have so much hope for.
And they were given basically a year and a half. They were given until the end of 2025 to come up to, meet with the public and meet with the experts and consult with everybody who needed to be consulted with and come up with a really solid plan that might hope to achieve some kind of consensus and bring about real change. And what happened instead was the election emboldened the governor and the Republicans, and it made the Democrats scared. And they didn't ditch the commission, but they pretty much shelved it. And they decided to go ahead with trying to create a reform plan this year instead of waiting for the commission to issue its report at the end of this year so that it could be taken up in the 2026 legislative session.
Yeah.
The ironic thing about this is that whatever plan passes this year is not going to take immediate effect. It's going to take effect in either 2 years or 3 years.
Right.
There would have been time to wait until 2026.
Mm-hmm.
And, that would have been the wisest course of action in January. It's even more of the best course of action now when we're, coming up with plans and trying to quickly run them through the fiscal analyzer tools and figure out whether they will actually work or not as they are being printed and rushed to the committee on conference and rushed to the floor of the legislature and rushed to the governor's desk. And this ain't no way to run a school system, but it's the way we're running the school system. And the hope that you hold out is that this bill won't be too awful. There won't be too many unintended consequences, and it will be something that they'll be able to fix next year. Maybe with the input from the Commission on the Future of Public Education. And that's not, when you write a bill and you pass a bill, you almost never get it 100% right the first time.
You always have to go back and tweak things.
You always have to go back and tweak things. But in this case, it seems like we are rushing for no good reason other than to fulfill some perceived desire for action right now.
What's so interesting about that too, John, is I think, going into January, at the beginning of the session, so many people were worried about property taxes related to the education system. And we could have done something this session that was only about property taxes,
Well,
whether putting in some bridge funding or something, but an overhaul of the whole structure did not necessarily have to happen this session.
yeah, we did pass a bill. The legislature did pass a bill that will hold property taxes harmless by
Right.
basically borrowing some excess revenue from the general fund, which is not something you can do again next year.
No.
So it's kicking the can down the road in a very real sense, but they did at least address that. They kind of had to do that politically.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have to do the complete overhaul.
Yeah.
But you know, here we are. We're riding in the back of a runaway train and hoping it doesn't crash too badly.
Not too many broken legs. Um, in the interest of time, I want to shift gears, keeping the train metaphor going, um, and talk quickly about a conference you attended last week for the Investigative News Network.
Um,
Did I get that name right? INN?
Institute for Nonprofit News. I think there is another INN that's investigative, but this is the Institute for Nonprofit News. And I went there because
Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate it.
I'm on the board of the Hardwick Gazette, which is a community newspaper with very deep roots that went out of business as a for-profit, locally owned outfit a year and a half ago, and has been reborn as a community-governed nonprofit organization. The scene, and what I found at the conference was the field of journalism is just alive with talent and energy and dedication. People all over the country are trying to create nonprofit organizations to carry forward good journalism. You look at the landscape in Vermont right now, where would we be without, I mean, nonprofit journalism is a pretty new concept, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But in Vermont, VT Digger is a nonprofit. Vermont Public Radio and Television, nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
7 Days is a for-profit, but they do have a reader support program, so they do solicit donations. The daily newspapers, such as they are still for-profit, but they're really not doing a lot of journalism anymore. Just pick up a copy of the Burlington Free Press sometime and gasp at the paltriness of it all. A lot of the local weeklies have turned nonprofit. The Commons in Brattleboro is one example. I believe the Chester Telegraph is a nonprofit now.
I believe so too, yeah.
So
is the bridge in Montpelier still around?
the bridge in Montpelier is a very lively newspaper that is a nonprofit organization, the Hardwick Gazette. It's hard to imagine. I mean, we would have like virtually no journalism at all in Vermont if it wasn't for the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
And our hope for journalism in the future is that the nonprofit sector can be sustainable, can sustain newsrooms at the local, state, regional, and national level, and can create a safe space for good quality journalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a heavy lift. It is a difficult challenge to face. The Hardwick Gazette is not out of the woods by any means, but I went to this conference hoping to find ideas and possible solutions that we could apply to our situation. And I was kind of blown away by the quantity of talent, the quantity of thought, and the resources that are available to support nonprofit journalism. I mean, there are some big, big foundations that are investing heavily in nonprofit journalism. The Knight Foundation was there, and the MacArthur Foundation was there, and a bunch of others were there. And there are national organizations like INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News, among others, that are trying to support this growing movement. In a way, it reminded me of the anti-Trump protest movement, where there is so much energy on the ground level, and these national organizations are kind of trying to rush to keep up with it and channel it in some productive way.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the way it is with nonprofit journalism right now. It is a new field. It is a growing field. It is trying to meet a desperate need for quality reporting and quality information. And honestly, I have great hopes for it. I came away from the conference kind of bewildered and head full of ideas, but feeling much better about the project than I did before I went there, because there is so much thought and so much talent and so many resources being devoted to this effort. It does give me hope that we can recreate journalism as largely a nonprofit enterprise, or with a substantial, solid, sustainable nonprofit structure
Mhm.
that will provide a lot of good information for the public, and will also provide decent, secure jobs for reporters, which
That that would be a win-win.
desperately short supply, but is of no particular interest to most of the public. But those of us who work in the field or try to, it's something that we would really like to see. So, and I'm going to a conference. The University of Vermont is a leader in this area.
Mhm.
They have created, they have a center for community news, and they have a very active program where they train student journalists to produce stories for media outlets in Vermont. They have a very active internship program that the Hardwick Gazette has benefited from. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of good stuff going on, and that does make me, a lot more hopeful about the future than I was, 2 weeks ago.
Thank you for that roundup. Just quickly, was there one kind of tip or trick that is standing out to you right now that you took away from the conference?
Um, there are lots, but I will focus on one of the more inspiring conversations I had, and it relates directly to my being involved in a small market weekly publication.
Mhm.
I met the editor in chief of the Harpswell Anchor, which is in Harpswell, Maine.
Okay.
Like if you know the coast of Maine, you know that there are all kinds of islands and all kinds of long peninsulas hanging off of it. Harpswell is on one of those long peninsulas. It's
Okay.
northeast of Portland and south of Brunswick, Maine. It's a community of about 25,000. It is a resort town, with a much larger summer population, active tourist industry. Um, but they they're a small market. The Hardwick Gazette probably has less than 15,000 people in its communities. Um, I was probably representing the smallest organization at this national conference. Hartsville Anchor isn't much bigger, but they have a solid budget. They have an established, financial machine in ad sales and fundraising development, and they are successful.
Mhm.
They publish online constantly. Whenever they have stories, they post them online. They put out a print edition once a month that's kind of a best of the stuff that they published in the last year in digital form.
Oh, interesting.
And like I said, they have achieved real sustainability, almost success. And, I sort of came away from that, and I had similar encounters with other people from other small operations across the country, um, who, have done some very creative things to create space and make their operations sustainable. And I heard one thing that I will point out that I heard from someone from Report for America, which is one of these big national
Yeah.
organizations trying to help support and enable nonprofit journalism. Um, she said to me that they have seen huge success with outlets just like mine, and like the Bridge in Montpelier and the Telegraph in Chester, and all the other small papers that have been in their communities for a long time and are now trying to operate as nonprofits. That they have a deep well of community support
Mm.
that they can draw on. They don't have to introduce themselves as, "Hey, we're the new kid on the block, and we're going to do some great stuff." They can look back, we can look back and say the Gazette has been here for 140 years. And since we became nonprofit, we have put out a good paper in digital form
Mm-hmm.
every week on time. Solid product. It would otherwise be a news desert. There would be little to no coverage of any of these communities. Um, and we have a valuable product to sell. And that's what it's going to take is some entrepreneurship uh, and some real focus on achieving financial sustainability. But I came away from the conference believing that there are ways to make it succeed, rather than just like this vague thinking that, well, if we could only manage to find some rich people, or we could only manage to tap into community goodwill, or how do we do this? And I've never done anything like this. Most journalists have never done anything like this. They're developing new muscles,
Mm-hmm.
and they are, as I heard more than once, building the plane while they're flying. Uh,
Yes.
but in some ways, it's a more exciting time than it was 5 or 10 years ago when the for-profit outlets were dying
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't really know what was going to replace them. Now we at
Yeah.
least have an idea of what could replace them or supplement them.
Well, John, thank you for that. It's nice to end on a positive, uplifted note here after our conversation. John, if people want to read your work, where can they find it?
Yeah, my blog is called the Vermont Political Observer, and it is the VPO.org. If you Google the Vermont Political Observer, or if you Google the VPO, you'll find me. So it's pretty easy.
Why, thank you, John. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2, rebroadcasted on Wednesday morning and wherever you find your podcasts. Everybody, take care. Have a good weekend.